So what we're going to do now is move through the program that we have set forward. First, we're going to give a bit of an introduction to make sure that we understand what we're talking about, what this category of for-profit higher education is, provide some definitions and examples. And then we're going to walk through what the experience is like, what the process for a student might be like in terms of moving through the program, and including some of the issues that have particular policy relevance today. So let me start out with just a brief discussion about what we mean by for-profit higher education. The official definition, and this is a definition that comes from the U.S. Department of Education, the National Center for Education Statistics, is a private for-profit institution is a private institution in which the individuals or agency in control receives compensation other than wages, rent, or other expenses for the assumption of risk. And basically what that means is that these institutions, they can make excess revenue. The excess revenue is not what makes them for-profit. It's what they can do with that excess revenue. They can pay things other than wages, rent, and other expenses. And the rationale is that there's a risk involved for these institutions, and that's compensation for assuming the risk. The distinction with a private nonprofit institution, on the other hand, is they're what's known as eleemosynary institutions, which basically means that they're charitable, that they're devoted to a charitable function. They too can make excess revenue, but all of the money from that excess revenue has to go back into the charitable function for which they have gotten nonprofit status. For-profits, on the other hand, can use their excess revenue for the most uncharitable purposes they want. There's no restriction on what they can do with their money. Maybe a couple of other people might want to have some comments more generally on what distinctions between for-profits and nonprofits are. Maybe Barmak or Alsamundia.
Well, I mean, I think we all intuitively understand that there are two sectors in higher ed. Whether you're public or private nonprofit, you operate as a charity. That is the history of higher education in this country. It was always a cause and a calling and a vocation. This is very important because it's important to understand that if the sort of representation I may provide later hold any water, it explains why it is that we have a system that is operating on the honor system. Because historically, there was no money in education. You didn't come to higher education to make money. You went into banking, you became a captain of industry. There was no money involved. It was a vocation. And therefore, most of the oversight that has evolved historically to control higher ed has been oversight addressing incompetence. It's been focused on making sure that that everybody assumed for historical reasons stepped forward in good faith, since there was no other possible incentive involved, are actually qualified to do the job that you've taken on. It never occurred to anybody as for-profit entities began to get involved in this line of work that there may be a purpose of evasion involved, that there may be that the folks coming forward are quite competent, but that they have goals that are completely the opposite of what historically motivated other people to enter this business. So the roots of the sector's involvement in education are generally vocational. It used to be that the plumber who was kind of getting up in age and didn't have the physical strength necessarily to do plumbing work, but had enormous knowledge, used to take on apprentices, and at some point figured out, well, you know, maybe I ought to get out of the plumbing business and teach plumbing. And as with most other activities, billions of dollars of federal money poured in the form of initially the GI Bill, and then subsequently the Higher Education Act, which vested them in the system. And that's when we began to deal generally, 20 years ago when I began in this line of work, the problem in for-profits was focused on vocational schools that were oftentimes mom and pops. So to whatever extent there was fraud or abuse or wasteful behavior, first of all, it was generally sort of amateurish, and it was done on a very low scale of actual operation. In the late 80s, as the system began, and again, this is a period of deregulation, lack of oversight, friends in high places, in the late 80s, we began to see the sort of nascent stages of what we're dealing with now, which is the infamous case of Phillips Colleges, which actually sort of became a model for what has ensued, of a chain of institutions with corporate ownership and execution on a larger scale. And of course, in the 2000s, again, deregulation of friends in high places, the actual sort of entry of Wall Street and the advent of public trading, and the execution of what can only be described as a business model as very akin to consumer fraud on steroids, and that the steroids are public trading and Wall Street financing.
I also want to just make two points. The first is that, to be fair, some of the concepts between nonprofits and for-profits are similar. Nonprofits do seek to maximize their revenues, sometimes through royalty streams from intellectual property licensing. They have research and contract grants. Donors in the nonprofit context might be likened to investors in the for-profit context. Endowment in the nonprofit context might be likened to private investment capital in the for-profit context. So the distinction for me has really been this sort of non-distribution constraint, the inability of nonprofits to be able to distribute those revenues that they do maximize to investors or shareholders. I also want to talk a little bit normatively about what this means to allow people to make money off of educating people. Education is a difficult good to assess or sometimes even define, and we see that with goods like this, it lends itself to exploitation, especially if people are trying to maximize revenue in that context. We've repeatedly seen in different industries, especially in the healthcare field, that particularly when we're dealing with a vulnerable population, maybe indigent people, low-income people, minority students or veterans, that nonprofits do a better job at providing services to that group, particularly because that motivation to exploit is not there. But I also want to talk about how education is a public good. It benefits all of us. It benefits society to have everyone educated. And we've had a history of publicly subsidizing education in the K-12 context, also through our public colleges and universities. But that trend has reversed. Public support for public education is on the wane. And as we've seen that decreasing, we've seen this embrace of a for-profit model. This is problematic given the extent to which for-profits don't have the mission, the service missions, the commitment to society that nonprofits do. They're not interested in cultivating a more informed citizenry. They're not interested in passing on democratic values. And yet they lean very heavily on public dollars. And so we're seeing this decrease for support for nonprofits, this embrace of a for-profit model, at a time where we really should be thinking about what the value of education is and where our money should be going. It should be going to institutions that are helping us, whose primary mission, right, is to help us advance as a society rather than to maximize the bottom line at the end of the day.
Good, thank you. We've hinted a little bit at the history of the for-profit higher education, and just to be clear, for-profits are not new. What is new is this dominance of a Wall Street or corporate-owned or shareholder-owned model for delivering higher education, particularly higher education at the degree level. These are four-year degree granting institutions. That is what we're really talking about as being new and being part of the universe, and it's largely what we're focusing on today as opposed to the lower level non-degree training schools, though we'll certainly talk a bit about those as well. Let me just give you a quick overview of some of these big publicly traded companies that are running for-profit higher education. I'll give you some of the top 5 or 6 in terms of enrollment. We have the Apollo Group, which is the owner of the University of Phoenix and a couple of other smaller institutions. It is by far the biggest for-profit in the United States, with somewhere north of 500,000 students, depending on how you count them. Education Management Corporation, EDMC, which is based here in Pittsburgh. They own the Art Institutes, Argosy, Brown Mackey, South, and that's some of the people here have specific experience in working with them. We'll talk about those as well. They're the second biggest. DeVry University is the second one with campuses across the third largest, I'm sorry, with campuses across the country. Career Education Corporation, which owns American Intercontinental, Colorado Technical University, Le Cordon Bleu, and Sanford Brown. Corinthian Colleges, which owns Everest, Wyotech, and Heald Colleges. American Public Education, which runs American Public University System. Despite the name, it is a for-profit institution, even though it's called Public University System. It has a particular market in serving military personnel. Bridgepoint, which owns Ashford, which is primarily a distance education university. And then others, ITT, Strayer, Grand Canyon, Capella, Lincoln Education, UTI, and National American University round out the bunch. There's a couple of other large ones that also, but are not publicly traded, places like Brighton Stratton, for example, would be those. We maybe have just a couple of minutes if anyone wants to have any particular comment on the large for-profits here that, that might want to comment on anything you know about them or have had experience with any of these.
In my experience, I've never been one to sugarcoat it, and in my experience as both a consumer and now an advocate, honestly, I feel that they're an elaborate corporate scam to funnel as many government Pell Grants and guaranteed loans out of the students as they can and leave them with the bill. And there's, after they get that bill, there's usually no real way to handle it. There's no consumer rights on those loans. At least for the private loans, which are honestly a majority of the issue, from my point of view anyway.
I mean, these institutions have really reached mainstream acceptance. In July 2010, I think the 14th largest publicly traded for-profits were worth more than $26 billion. It's a lot of money. Former leaders of nonprofit institutions now serve on for-profit boards. And it also mirrors a rhetoric that we have about K-12 education, privatizing K-12 education, seeing for-profit schemes there, or even larger social issues, privatizing Social Security. This idea that we're going to release things to the market, and that has become a very mainstream dialogue that we're having, and for-profits, I think, are just, for-profit higher education is just one part of that larger trend that we're seeing.
Good, thanks. So I think another point to make sure that we're clear is that these institutions, one of the reasons why they've gotten so much attention lately is because they're so big. They've grown so fast. I mentioned University of Phoenix has more than 500,000 students enrolled. Overall, there's over 3 million students enrolled in the for-profit sector, according to the latest data, and that's probably a conservative estimate for how many students are actively involved. And these numbers, while they are large in and of themselves, what is really most dramatic is how quickly that they've increased. The number of students has grown exponentially over the last 10 to 15 years and really has now, by many accounts, approximately 10% of all students in higher education today. So we're talking about a substantial, this is no longer a rounding error in higher education. It's something that we should be looking at and taking seriously in terms of how it contributes to the overall education model that we have here in the United States.